Okay, let's unpack this. Do you ever just feel like you're drowning in news and information?
Oh, definitely.
Headlines just flying at you about, global powers, economic shifts, military moves, tech battles.
It's a lot.
It really is. It can feel overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
Like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Yeah, exactly. Hard to get a clear picture.
It's so hard to get a clear grasp of what's truly shaping the world, and maybe more importantly, why it actually matters to you.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission in this deep dive really is to help you cut through all that noise. We've taken a good look at a range of material covering one of the most significant dynamics playing out on the global stage today.
A really defining dynamic.
Absolutely. And we're going to try and extract the most important insights, the key pieces of the puzzle, so you can feel genuinely informed about it, not just surface level.
And what we're focusing on is, well, it's China's remarkable journey over the past few decades. It's this rapid and multifaceted ascent.
Multifaceted is the word.
Yeah, from a relatively poor, largely agrarian economy to becoming a major global player. And not just in one area, but across economics, military strength, technology, and geopolitics.
All of it simultaneously almost.
Pretty much. And as you might expect, this dramatic rise has fundamentally reshaped the international landscape.
No question.
Which leads, inevitably perhaps, to this complex relationship, often characterized, let's be honest, as a direct rivalry with the long-established global power, the United States.
Exactly. And that's what we want to explore, dimension by dimension. We'll dig into the sheer scale of China's economic growth. It's just mind-boggling when you look at the numbers.
Really?
Then there's the incredible speed and maybe the focus of its military modernization.
Yeah, the focus is key.
And its emergence as a technological force to be reckoned with globally.
In some areas, leading the pack.
Right. And finally, how it's managed to extend its influence, its reach, all around the world.
Yeah.
And as we go through each of these areas, we'll pinpoint where the specific points of tension, the friction points, have cropped up with the U.S.
So by the end of this deep dive, the idea is that you'll have a much clearer understanding of, well, the scale of this transformation, first off.
Right.
And also some of the core strategies at play, who the significant actors are, and critically, why this dynamic isn't just some abstract geopolitical chess game.
It's not just headlines.
No, it has real implications. For you, for the global future, for the things you buy, the tech you use. It connects to everything.
Okay, so where do we start peeling back these layers? I think the foundation, really, the bedrock of China's transformation over these past few decades has got to be its economy.
Absolutely. You have to start there.
This wasn't just, steady growth. It was a fundamental restructuring, an expansion on a scale. I mean, has the world ever seen anything quite like it before?
That's a fair question. The shift has been nothing short of revolutionary. I mean, just think about the starting point.
Like, where'd they come from?
A nation that was, predominantly agricultural, relatively isolated from the global economy, and frankly, quite poor by global standards.
Right.
Fast forward just a few decades, which is incredibly short in historical terms for this kind of change, and boom, it's the world's second largest economy.
And it wasn't a slow, gradual evolution over centuries like we saw with, say, Britain during the Industrial Revolution or the U.S. rise?
Not at all. This was concentrated. A decades-long, sustained, high-speed boom that fundamentally altered the entire global economic map. It shifted the center of gravity.
The numbers really drive this home, don't they?
Yeah.
We saw figures showing China's GDP, the gross domestic product, hitting roughly, what was it, USD? 18.3 trillion in 2022.
Around that mark, yeah. And you have to compare that to put it in context.
Exactly. So the U.S. economy, the biggest, was around USD 25 trillion that same year.
Still larger, yes.
Still larger, but China's is already about 73% the size of the U.S. economy by that core measure. Just pause and think about that.
It's huge.
Rapidly approaching 3/4 the size of what's been the dominant global economy for, most of our lifetimes. It just speaks volumes about the sheer speed and scale of this change.
And maybe even more striking is the impact this growth has had, not just within China, but on the global stage.
Right, its external effect.
Exactly. Over just the last 15 years or so, China has been the single largest contributor to global GDP growth.
The single largest.
Yes, accounting for a massive 35% of all global growth in that period.
Wow. 35%.
Compare that to the United States, still hugely important, of course, but the U.S. contributed about 27% during that same time frame.
So China's contribution was significantly bigger.
Significantly bigger. This makes it crystal clear that China hasn't just grown itself. It's been the primary engine, the main locomotive, pulling the global economy forward for well over a decade now. It's lifted overall world growth.
And, there's always lots of analysis, lots of talk about potential slowdowns, structural challenges within China's economy, real estate bubbles, debt, demographics.
Sure, that those issues are definitely there and widely discussed.
But even with those headwinds, it's important to note that its recent growth still remains pretty substantial, doesn't it?
It does. For instance, they met their 2024 growth target, which was around 5%.
Which, for an economy that's already the second largest in the world, 5% is?
Yeah.
Well, it's a huge absolute number.
It adds a tremendous amount of value to the global economy each year. Still a massive contribution. And the reports indicate that this growth was fueled by key sectors like industry and, significantly, exports.
Which brings us right to that export powerhouse status.
Yep. China is now, without any dispute, the world's #1 exporter of goods.
Number one.
By a significant margin. And this naturally leads to the creation of very large trade surpluses.
Meaning they sell way more stuff to other countries than they buy back?
Exactly, particularly with major trading partners like the European Union and, crucially for this story, the United States.
Okay, and this is where that economic strength really starts to become a major point of international friction.
Right. This is a core area of tension.
Yes, these massive, persistent trade surpluses. They lead to significant concerns elsewhere about, quote-unquote, global imbalances.
That's the term often used.
When other countries, especially the U.S., look at those enormous deficit numbers on their side, questions immediately get raised about the fundamental fairness of the trade relationship. Is it a level playing field?
And those questions quickly turn into accusations.
Right. We see constant accusations of unfair trade practices, particularly related to extensive state subsidies provided by Beijing to Chinese companies.
The argument being that these subsidies give Chinese firms an artificial competitive advantage in global markets, allowing them to undercut competitors.
And this isn't some minor technical dispute. It's a major, persistent source of tension. It's been at the heart of the U.S.-China trade conflict for years now.
Absolutely, with the U.S., with the EU, with other major economies, too.
Okay, so beyond just the trade in physical goods, China's role in international investment has also just exploded.
Dramatically expanded, yes. Both inwards and outwards.
Let's talk inwards first. It became the second largest recipient of foreign direct investment, FDI, globally.
That's right. For many years, attracting enormous amounts of capital from multinational corporations, they wanted access to that huge domestic market, obviously, but also its manufacturing capabilities.
Setting up factories, supply chains.
Exactly. Though, it's worth noting, we have seen some reports suggesting a bit of a slowdown in those FDI inflows more recently, some companies rethinking diversification.
Interesting. But just as important as the money flowing into China, maybe even more so strategically, is the money flowing out.
The outbound investment, yes. This is huge. Beijing has become a massive overseas investor itself.
And where is that money going? What's it doing?
A lot of it is highly visible in large-scale infrastructure projects. Think roads, railways, ports, power plants, dams, telecommunications networks.
Building things.
Building big things, often in regions like Africa and Latin America, but also across Asia and parts of Europe.
And this isn't just like transactional trade, buying and selling. This feels different.
It is different. It's about building deep, long-term physical connections. It's about establishing economic ties that are literally concrete and steel. These investments reshape global supply chains, they create new economic dependencies for the host countries, and they extend China's economic influence directly into the physical landscape of nations around the world.
Building influence through building infrastructure.
That's a good way to put it. And China's growing influence isn't just physical, it extends right into the global financial architecture itself.
How so? This sounds a bit more technical.
It can seem technical, but it's strategically really significant. Think about institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, or the World Bank.
The big global financial bodies set up after World War II, largely U.S.-led initially.
Precisely. Well, China's voting power within these institutions has been steadily increasing as its economy has grown. For example, its share in the IMF has risen to about 6%.
Okay, 6%. How does that compare?
Well, the U.S. still holds the largest share, around 16.5%, which gives it veto power over major decisions. But China's 6% makes it the third largest shareholder now, after the U.S. and Japan. And similar gains have been made in the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank.
And why does that seemingly small percentage point matter so much?
Because more voting power means more leverage. It means more, say, in shaping the rules of the international financial system. It influences how development aid is allocated, what conditions are attached to loans, and what the priorities are for global economic governance. It's about having a bigger, louder voice at the table where the global economic rules get written and enforced.
So influencing the existing system from within.
Yes, but they haven't been content with just doing that. China has also actively established its own parallel structures, creating new institutions where it plays a leading role.
Like what?
The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, is a prime example. It's a new multilateral development bank headquartered in Beijing, focused on funding infrastructure in Asia and beyond. China is the largest shareholder by far.
So creating an alternative to the World Bank, or ADB, in a way.
Seen by many that way, yes. Or at least a complementary institution where China sets the tone. And perhaps the most visible, most ambitious manifestation of this outward economic and strategic push is the vast Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
Ah, yes, the BRI. You hear that term constantly. What exactly is it, in simple terms?
Well, it's often called a mega program, and honestly, that's probably accurate. It's an incredibly ambitious plan launched by Xi Jinping to build this sprawling network of global transport and energy infrastructure.
We're talking ports, railways, pipelines, power plants.
All of the above, physically linking China across Asia, into Europe, down into Africa, and now increasingly extending its reach into Latin America as well.
So connecting the world, physically, back to China.
That's the core idea. China officially presents this as a project of mutual benefit, win-win cooperation aimed at facilitating trade, boosting connectivity, and driving development for all the countries involved along these belts and roads.
That's the official narrative. But there's a strong counter-narrative, isn't there? Particularly from the West.
Oh, absolutely. The view from Washington and many other Western capitals is quite different. They tend to view the BRI primarily through a strategic, geopolitical lens.
Not just economics, but power politics.
Exactly. Analyses from think tanks like Brookings, for example, point out that the sheer scale and nature of the BRI are interpreted as a clear reflection of the immense scale of China's global ambitions.
Ambitions for what, exactly?
Ambitions for greater influence, greater control over trade routes, securing access to resources. Brookings explicitly notes that the BRI has provoked significant concern in Washington. It's seen less as a development project and more as a strategic one.
How so? What are the specific concerns?
Concerns that it's designed to create economic dependencies, where countries become heavily indebted to China. Concerns about gaining strategic footholds, maybe control over critical ports or infrastructure that could have dual civilian-military use down the line.
Debt trap diplomacy is a term you sometimes hear.
That term is used, though China strongly rejects it. But the overall Western perspective often frames the BRI as a way for China to fundamentally reshape the global order in its favor, building these physical connections and economic leverage across continents to serve its long-term strategic goals. It's economic power being explicitly translated into geopolitical reach.
Okay, so that gives us a really good sense of the scale and the global impact of China's economic rise and how that economic power is being projected outwards. But as you hinted earlier, China's rise isn't just economic.
No, not by a long shot. It's fundamentally about power in its broadest sense. And that brings us squarely to the second major dimension, the rapid and very extensive modernization of its military.
This has also been described as a transformation, right? The People's Liberation Army, the PLA.
A complete overhaul, really. The PLA has modernized with incredible speed and, again, remarkable focus over the past couple of decades, especially.
And the result?
The result is that it's now widely regarded as the world's second most powerful military force, still behind the U.S. overall, but rapidly closing the gap in key areas, particularly in its home region.
And the investment figures, they tell a story too, don't they?
They certainly do. China's official military spending reached around USD 296 billion in 2023.
296 billion. That sounds like a huge number.
It is a substantial figure, absolutely. And what's Perhaps more significant than the absolute number is the trend. That figure represented a consistent year-on-year increase, around 6% that year. It's been growing steadily for
Okay,
years.
but we need perspective, right? How does that 296 billion compare to, say, the US?
Right. It's crucial to keep that perspective. U.S. military spending in that same year, 2023, was considerably higher, way higher, actually, around USD 916 billion.
So more than 3 times China's official figure.
Roughly, yes, based on official figures. Some analysts suspect China's actual spending might be higher than reported, but even so, the U.S. budget remains significantly larger.
So the total figure is smaller. But you said the growth rate and the focus are key.
Exactly. The sustained, steady growth rate of China's budget year after year is one crucial aspect. The other is the highly targeted nature of their investment. They aren't just spending more money across the board.
They're building specific capabilities.
Precisely. It's a focused effort on modernizing key areas, developing specific weapon systems, and building the capacity needed to project power regionally and increasingly beyond, and importantly, to deny access to potential adversaries trying to operate near China.
Okay. So in terms of size, the PLA is huge overall, right? Personnel numbers.
Immense, around 2 million active personnel,
Mhm.
plus large reserves. And they have thousands of tanks, aircraft, artillery pieces, a massive land army.
But a lot of the focus strategically seems to be on the naval expansion.
That's where some of the most dramatic and strategically significant changes have occurred. The plan, the People's Liberation Army Navy, has undergone a massive expansion and modernization.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
In 2023, their fleet was estimated to number over 370 ships and submarines. That makes it the largest navy in the world by number of hulls, surpassing the U.S. Navy in sheer quantity, though not necessarily in overall tonnage or capability yet.
Over 370 vessels. And that includes...
That figure includes more than 140 major surface combatants, destroyers, frigates, corvettes. This is a massive modern naval force being built at an incredible pace.
And why is a large modern navy so crucial for a global power?
Well, historically and today, a powerful navy is the primary tool for a nation to project power far beyond its own shores. It's how you protect your global trade routes, how you safeguard your overseas interests, how you influence events in distant regions, and how you potentially challenge other naval powers. You need ships that can operate far from home for sustained periods.
And this growing fleet now includes increasingly sophisticated, high-end assets, doesn't it? Like aircraft carriers.
Yes. That's a huge development.
Why?
They now operate 3 aircraft carriers. First was the Liaoning, which was a refurbished carrier bought from Ukraine, mostly for training initially.
Right, running the ropes.
Then came the Shandong, their first domestically built carrier, based on the Liaoning design, but with improvements. And the third, the Fujian, is their newest and most advanced. It's currently undergoing sea trials.
And the Fujian is different. More advanced how?
Significantly more advanced. It's larger, and crucially, it features electromagnetic catapults for launching aircraft, similar to the latest U.S. carriers. That allows it to launch heavier, more capable aircraft, potentially including stealth fighters and airborne early warning planes, giving it much greater combat power than the first 2 ski jump carriers.
So 3 carriers now, with increasing capability. It's a major statement for power projection.
Absolutely. Aircraft carriers are floating air bases. They are critical symbols and tools for projecting air power and demonstrating military presence across vast oceans, far from mainland bases. And alongside the carriers, they've been rapidly building out their submarine fleet.
Subs too. What kind?
Both conventional diesel-electric submarines, which are very quiet and effective in coastal waters, and also a growing number of advanced nuclear-powered submarines.
Nuclear subs are key for long-range operations, right?
Exactly. Nuclear-powered attack submarines, SSNs, can stay submerged for months and travel globally hunting other ships and subs. And they're also building more nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, which carry long-range nuclear missiles. These provide a secure, sea-based second strike nuclear deterrent capability, so a more robust nuclear posture overall.
Okay, carriers, submarines.
Yeah.
What about the weapons these ships carry, the weapons designed to counter other ships?
This is another area of intense focus and concern for potential rivals. China has invested heavily in advanced anti-ship weapon systems, specifically designed to challenge powerful navies, particularly the U.S. Navy operating in the Western Pacific.
You mentioned the carrier killer missile earlier.
Right, the DF-21D is perhaps the most famous example. It's an anti-ship ballistic missile, ASBM. Think of a ballistic missile, usually used for land targets, but equipped with sophisticated guidance systems to target a large, moving ship like an aircraft carrier at sea.
And the idea is to hit it from hundreds of miles away.
Hundreds, potentially over 1,000 miles away. The goal is to hold these incredibly valuable assets, U.S. carriers at risk, from distances far beyond the reach of the carrier's own defensive aircraft. It makes it incredibly dangerous for a carrier group to operate close to the Chinese coast.
A way to keep them at bay.
Exactly. And they're not stopping there. They are also developing and fielding hypersonic missiles, weapons that travel at extreme speeds, potentially over Mach 5, and can maneuver, making them incredibly difficult to track and intercept. Plus, they're deploying highly advanced, long-range surface-to-air missile systems, both on land and increasingly on their warships.
So layered defenses and long-range strike capabilities.
Precisely. These capabilities are all integral parts of that broader strategy we might discuss later, often called A2AD, anti-accessoria denial. It's about making it incredibly risky and difficult for potential adversaries, primarily the U.S., to project power into China's near seas.
Okay, that's the Navy. What about the Air Force? Has it seen similar upgrades?
Absolutely. The People's Liberation Army Air Force, PLAAF, has also undergone a complete overhaul, moving from large numbers of older Soviet-era designs to fielding state-of-the-art, domestically produced aircraft.
Like stealth fighters.
Yes. The most prominent example is the Chengdu J-20. It's a large, twin-engine stealth fighter, often compared to the American F-22 and F-35. China is producing these in significant numbers now.
And they're still developing it further.
Constantly. We've seen reports about them developing a two-seat version, perhaps for command and control or electronic warfare roles. And there are ongoing plans to equip them with more powerful, domestically produced engines, which has been a bit of a bottleneck for them historically, improving performance.
So top-tier fighters. What about bombers?
They have significantly modernized their strategic bomber fleet as well. The main aircraft here is the H-6 bomber, which is based on an old Soviet design, but the latest versions, like the H-6K and the even newer H-6N, capable of air-to-air refueling, are vastly more capable.
How so? What can they do now?
They've been upgraded with modern engines, avionics, and crucially, the ability to carry multiple long-range cruise missiles. An H-6K can reportedly carry up to 6 missiles, like the CJ-20 land attack cruise missile, which has a very long range. This gives them a standoff strategic strike capability. They can launch attacks against targets across the region and potentially further without having to fly directly over heavily defended areas.
So a serious long-range conventional strike threat.
Yes. And potentially nuclear strike as well for some variants.
And beyond planes and ships, this modernization covers other areas too, newer domains of warfare.
It's truly comprehensive. It extends deep into the newer domains that are absolutely critical for modern warfare. For example, they are rapidly developing and fielding a wide array of armed drones, or UAVs, for reconnaissance, surveillance, and strike missions. They're becoming a major exporter of drones, too. A huge expansion of their network of military satellites. These are crucial for modern command and control, communications, intelligence gathering, ISR intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, navigation, and targeting. You can't fight a modern war effectively without robust space capabilities.
And cyber. Electronic warfare.
Definitely. Building sophisticated electronic warfare, EW capabilities, to jam or disrupt enemy radars, communications, and guidance systems. And, as we'll likely discuss more later, investing heavily in cyber capabilities, both defensive and offensive, to target adversary networks and systems.
So it really sounds like this isn't just about buying shiny new equipment. It's a deeply strategic, whole of military effort.
Absolutely. It's a strategic effort to become a top-tier military power, capable of defending what it sees as its core interests, projecting power regionally, challenging the U.S. military dominance in the Pacific, and operating effectively across all domains of modern conflict: land, sea, air, space, and cyber. It's a fundamental shift in the military balance of power.
Okay, so we've looked at the hardware, the investment, the capabilities. Now let's pivot slightly and look at where this growing military power is actually being used or projected. What does that tell us about China's strategic objectives and its growing geopolitical presence, particularly the military side of things?
Right. Where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. And a primary area where China's growing military presence is most acutely felt and where it creates significant international tension is undoubtedly the South China Sea.
A hugely important waterway, claimed by multiple countries.
Exactly. Vital for global trade, rich in resources. China claims almost all of it, based on its controversial nine-dash line, overlapping with claims from Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan.
And China hasn't just claimed it on paper. They've been physically changing the area.
Dramatically so. Over the past decade or so, China has been steadily building out its military footprint there. This includes the really controversial construction of large artificial islands on top of previously submerged reefs and small islets in places like the Spratly and Paracel Island groups.
Building islands from scratch, basically.
Pretty much. Dredging sand and coral on a massive scale. And these aren't just civilian outposts or fishing shelters. They've been heavily militarized.
Militarized how? What's on these islands?
They're equipped with long runways, capable of handling large military aircraft, including fighters and bombers. They have reinforced aircraft hangars, barracks for troops, advanced radar arrays, communication facilities, and crucially, emplacements for missile systems, surface-to-air missiles to defend the islands, and potentially anti-ship cruise missiles to control the surrounding waters.
So effectively, unsinkable aircraft carriers and missile bases spread across the South China Sea.
That's exactly how many analysts view them. They give China significant strategic advantages in projecting power throughout the region, monitoring maritime traffic, and potentially enforcing its extensive territorial claims across this vital international waterway. They've fundamentally changed the physical and strategic reality on the ground, or rather on the sea.
And we've seen examples of China using this strengthened position, deploying forces more assertively.
Yes, we've seen concrete examples of this more muscular military posture in action. For instance, there was a Reuters report, I think it was May 2025, that highlighted really large-scale Chinese naval deployments occurring routinely.
Large scale how?
They described observing Chinese fleets, sometimes numbering 60 to 70 ships, operating concurrently in different sensitive areas, including modern frigates, destroyers, large Coast Guard cutters, which are often used assertively, and support vessels.
60 to 70 ships at once. That's a lot of firepower.
It's a significant deployment. And these flotillas were operating near sensitive zones like Taiwan, near Japan's southern islands, and widely throughout the South China Sea, often shadowing U.S. or allied warships.
And critically, these deployments sometimes included their aircraft carriers.
Yes, the report mentions sightings of both the Shandong and the Liaoning leading some of these task groups. Deploying carriers isn't just routine patrol, it's a deliberate demonstration of a growing capability for sustained, long-range naval operations and power projection far from the mainland.
And what's the impact of these kinds of large-scale deployments, especially near disputed territories or other countries' coastlines?
Well, deployments of that scale and composition, especially when they operate assertively near disputed islands or close to the coastlines of neighboring nations like the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Japan, it dramatically escalates tensions in the region.
Understandably.
These actions are often interpreted by neighbors and by the U.S. as attempts to normalize China's presence, intimidate rivals, assert de facto control over vast areas of the South China Sea, and push back against the naval presence of other countries.
Particularly the U.S. Navy and its allies, who conduct freedom of navigation operations or FONABs through those waters.
Exactly. China sees FONABs as provocations, while the U.S. sees them as upholding international law. So these deployments often seem aimed at challenging those operations and asserting China's dominance within what's strategically known as the First Island Chain.
Can you quickly remind us what the First Island Chain is?
Sure. It's a concept in U.S. strategic thinking referring to the string of major archipelagos running from the Japanese islands through Taiwan, the Philippines, down to Borneo. It essentially encloses China's coastal seas. Controlling access through this chain is crucial for naval power projection into the Western Pacific. China's actions seem designed to dominate within this chain and be able to project power beyond it.
Okay, and this more assertive military posture in the region, the island building, the large deployments, it ties directly into that broader Chinese military strategy you mentioned earlier, A2AD.
Yes, anti-accessoria denial. It's perfectly illustrated by what they're doing in the South China Sea and around Taiwan.
Could you break down A2AD again? What does it actually mean in practical terms, and what's the ultimate goal?
Think of it as creating a multi-layered keep-out zone. A defensive shield, but one packed with offensive capabilities designed to inflict heavy losses on any force trying to enter.
So anti-access means preventing forces from getting into the theater of operations in the first place.
Right, making it too dangerous for them to even approach. Using things like long-range missiles to threaten ships and air bases far out.
And area denial means?
Area denial means making it impossible or prohibitively costly for forces that do manage to get inside the zone to operate effectively. So even if a U.S. carrier group gets relatively close, the goal is to deny them the freedom to maneuver, launch aircraft, or strike targets without facing unacceptable risks from submarines, missiles, aircraft, electronic attack, etc.
So the goal is basically deterrence through denial, to deter the U.S. or others from intervening militarily in a regional crisis, say involving Taiwan or the South China Sea.
That's the core objective from China's perspective. To raise the costs and risk of intervention so incredibly high that an adversary, specifically the United States military and its allies, is discouraged from even trying to enter or operate effectively within that defined area, primarily the Western Pacific region close to China's coastline and key interests.
Making intervention seem futile or just too costly in terms of potential losses.
Exactly. It's a strategy designed to counter traditional U.S. military advantages, like carrier strike groups, and push potential conflicts further away from the Chinese mainland, making any intervention extremely difficult, bloody, and potentially unsuccessful. It's about carving out a sphere where China is the dominant military power.
It sounds like a strategy aimed squarely at controlling the operating environment in their immediate neighborhood. Now, while all this focuses on conventional forces, ships, planes, missiles, we also need to touch upon China's nuclear arsenal again.
Yes, that's a critical piece of the strategic puzzle, even if it operates more in the background of deterrence.
We established earlier that while it's growing, it's still significantly smaller than the arsenals of the U.S. and Russia.
That's correct. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SciPI, estimated in their 2024 yearbook that China possessed around 500 nuclear warheads.
500. And the U.S. and Russia.
They each have arsenals numbering over 5,000 warheads. That includes deployed strategic warheads, stored warheads, and tactical weapons. So the absolute size difference remains vast, more than 10 to 1.
Right. But you also said it's the trajectory and the nature of China's nuclear developments that analysts are watching very closely. What's changing?
What's changing is a clear shift away from what was long seen as a doctrine of minimum deterrence, having just enough nuclear weapons to survive a first strike and retaliate, ensuring unacceptable damage to an attacker.
So, moving beyond the minimum.
It appears so. Several things point to this. First, satellite imagery has revealed that China has been constructing a very substantial number of new missile silos, hundreds of them, in its western desert regions.
Silos for land-based missiles.
Yes, for intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. This indicates a significant expansion and potential hardening of its land-based nuclear forces. Second, reports suggest they are developing new generations of solid-fuel ICBMs. Solid fuel makes missiles quicker to launch and easier to move, making them more survivable.
And these new missiles are comparable to U.S.-Russian ones.
Apparently comparable in range and potentially capable of carrying multiple warheads, MIRVs, similar to the most advanced ICBMs deployed by the U.S. and Russia. Third, they are expanding their sea-based deterrent with more SSBNs, as we mentioned. And fourth, modernizing their air delivery options with bombers like the H-6N.
So upgrading and expanding across all legs of the potential nuclear triad: land, sea, and air.
Exactly. While their total arsenal is still projected by most analysts to remain considerably smaller than those of the U.S. and Russia for the foreseeable future, this shift, building hundreds of new silos, developing advanced MIRV-capable ICBMs, potentially increasing warhead production signals, a move towards a much more robust, potentially larger and more capable nuclear deterrent.
What does that imply strategically?
It implies a changing strategic posture, moving beyond just surviving a first strike to perhaps wanting a more credible counterforce capability, or ensuring they can overwhelm missile defenses, or simply seeking greater strategic parity or leverage vis-a-vis the other major nuclear powers. It introduces new uncertainties into the global nuclear balance.
Okay, so we've covered the economy, the military,
Mm-hmm.
which brings us to the third major pillar of China's rise and what many believe is really the core competitive battleground of the 21st century: technology.
Absolutely. The tech race is central.
China has made just incredible, some might say stunning, advancements here. It's become a global leader, or at least a major competitor, in numerous cutting-edge sectors.
It truly has been a rapid, almost breathtaking technological emergence. Just a couple of decades ago, China was largely seen as a copier and assembler of technology developed elsewhere. That picture has radically changed.
How so? What are we seeing now?
We now see prominent Chinese technology companies that aren't just giants within China's huge domestic market, but are genuinely global players, achieving market dominance or leadership in specific critical areas.
Give us some examples. Who are we talking about?
Sure. Think about Huawei. Despite all the geopolitical pressure, it remains a global giant in telecommunications network equipment, especially 5G technology, and also consumer electronics like smartphones.
Okay, Huawei.
Mm.
Who?
ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok.
TikTok, which is everywhere.
Absolutely ubiquitous globally, a social media phenomenon driven by sophisticated algorithms. Then there's BYD, Build Your Dreams.
Ah, the electric vehicle company.
Exactly. Now, a world leader in EVs and, crucially, the batteries that power them. We also have the massive e-commerce and internet service conglomerates, Alibaba and Tencent, which are involved in everything from online shopping and payments to cloud computing and gaming.
Giants in the digital economy.
Huge. And even in areas like green energy, companies like Longji Solar are among the world's largest manufacturers of solar panels. These aren't just Chinese companies. They are global forces actively reshaping entire industries worldwide.
And you mentioned BYD as a specific example of this ascent.
Yes, the BYD story is really striking and makes this tangible. We saw data showing that in 2024, BYD actually surpassed Tesla to become the world's largest seller of electric vehicles globally.
Overtook Tesla. Wow.
Overtook Tesla in terms of volume, selling something like 4.27 million EVs globally that year. That was more than double Tesla's sales volume in the same period.
More than double. That's astonishing.
It really is. And it's not just assembling cars. They are also a massive battery manufacturer controlling a key part of the supply chain. This isn't just a sign of China catching up in manufacturing. It's a sign of achieving market leadership and massive industrial scale in critical, forward-looking industries like electric mobility. It clearly shows that in some crucial tech sectors, China isn't just playing catch-up anymore, it's setting the pace.
But this rapid technological rise, especially from state-influenced companies, hasn't been universally welcomed, has it?
Not at all. What's fascinating, and for many nations deeply concerning, is how these technological advancements are viewed internationally. There's widespread suspicion, particularly emanating from the United States and many of its allies.
Suspicion about what?
It's often framed around accusations of unfair practices, like state-sponsored industrial espionage, hacking into foreign companies to steal intellectual property and trade secrets.
Giving Chinese companies a leg up.
That's the accusation. And beyond theft, there are deep concerns that Chinese technologies themselves, especially in critical infrastructure like telecom networks or popular apps, could embed hidden security vulnerabilities or backdoors.
That goes for what? Spying.
Yes, concerns that these technologies could be exploited for surveillance by the Chinese government, or even used for disruption or cyber attacks in a crisis. National security concerns loom large.
The case of Huawei is probably the most prominent global example of these fears playing out, right?
Absolutely. Huawei became the poster child for these concerns. Washington, across multiple administrations, has alleged that Huawei's advanced 5G network equipment, the gear that powers next-generation mobile networks, could potentially be compelled by Beijing, under China's national security laws, to facilitate intelligence gathering or network disruption against other countries.
So the fear is the equipment itself could be turned into a spying tool.
That's the core allegation. This fear led directly to the U.S. government effectively banning Huawei from participating in the build-out of its domestic 5G networks, especially the core infrastructure.
And they didn't stop there, did they? They pressured allies, too.
No, the U.S. launched a major diplomatic campaign globally, actively pressuring allies in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere to also exclude Huawei from their own national 5G rollouts, citing these shared national security risks. It became a major point of friction between the U.S. and some allies who were initially hesitant.
And we're seeing similar kinds of concerns, similar accusations playing out more recently with TikTok.
Very similar dynamics, yes. Accusations have been leveled publicly in both the U.S. and the EU that the TikTok platform, because of its ownership by the China-based company ByteDance, could pose security risks.
What kind of risk this time?
Again, concerns about potential espionage. Could the Chinese government access the vast amounts of user data TikTok collects? Concerns about data privacy. And also concerns that the platform's powerful recommendation algorithms could be manipulated by Beijing to subtly disseminate Chinese propaganda, censor content critical of China, or influence public opinion and political discourse in other countries.
So data access and influence operations.
Those are the main buckets of concern. And this has led to ongoing debates, governmental investigations, bans on government devices in some places, and even serious legislative efforts in the U.S. aimed at potentially forcing a sale of TikTok's U.S. operations to a non-Chinese owner or facing a ban.
It really highlights the intersection of technology, security, and free speech concerns. Now, another area of incredibly intense global competition, maybe the area, is artificial intelligence, AI.
AI is absolutely central to future economic competitiveness and national security, and China has made becoming a world leader in AI a top national priority.
And they're backing that priority with resources.
Massively. China has poured billions upon billions of dollars into AI research, development, and implementation across various sectors. And one result of this push is that China is reportedly leading the world, by some metrics, in AI patent production.
Patent production, what do the numbers look like?
We saw one figure indicating that a really remarkable 69% of all global AI-related patents filed in recent years originated from China.
69%, nearly 7 out of 10 global AI patents.
That's the figure reported. Now, patent quantity doesn't always equal patent quality or groundbreaking innovation, but that sheer volume of patent activity is a very strong indicator of the immense scale of research and development happening within China in the AI space. They are generating a huge amount of intellectual property.
And which companies are leading this charge in China?
You have the big tech giants like Baidu, often called China's Google, heavily invested in AI and autonomous driving. Alibaba, using AI extensively in e-commerce, logistics, cloud services. And Tencent, AI in gaming, social media, fintech. But you also have specialized AI firms like SenseTime and Megvii, which are global leaders in areas like computer vision and facial recognition technology.
Facial recognition is a big one, often controversial too.
Very much so. China is a leader in deploying facial recognition and other AI-powered surveillance systems domestically, which raises significant human rights concerns internationally. But these companies are also competing globally in various AI applications, everything from autonomous vehicles and smart city infrastructure to developing the complex algorithms that power social media feeds, financial trading systems, medical diagnostics, and much more. The competition with the US and others in AI is fierce across the board.
Back in telecommunications, beyond the security fights over Huawei, China has built a really dominant position globally in just supplying the network gear itself, right?
Right. Yes. Through companies like Huawei and also ZTE, another major Chinese telecom equipment vendor, China has managed to capture a very significant share of the global market for telecom infrastructure.
Especially for 5G.
Especially for 5G. Despite the U.S. pressure campaign, Huawei and ZTE combined still control a substantial portion of the world market for 5G radio access networks and core network equipment, particularly in developing countries across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. This gives them considerable influence in the rollout of next-generation telecommunications infrastructure worldwide.
So significant strengths in AI, telecom networks, social media reach, EVs.
Yeah.
But are there areas where China is seen as having critical weaknesses or dependencies in technology?
Yes. Despite all these impressive strengths and areas of global leadership, analyses consistently, almost universally, highlight one key vulnerability for China, and it's a big one.
Which is?
Advanced semiconductor technology, specifically the design and, even more critically, the manufacturing of the most cutting-edge microchips.
The chips that power everything.
Exactly. The tiny, incredibly complex components that are the brains behind smartphones, computers, data centers, AI systems, advanced weapons systems, pretty much all modern technology.
And China is dependent here.
Significantly dependent, yes. Especially for the most advanced chips, those with the smallest transistors measured in nanometers, like 7 millimeters, 5 millimeter, 3 millimeter nodes. China relies heavily on foreign technology. Foreign chip designs, often from US or UK companies like ARM, specialized manufacturing equipment, especially from Dutch company ASML for lithography, and actual manufacturing foundries located outside mainland China, particularly the giant TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in South Korea.
So they can design some chips, but struggle to manufacture the very best ones at scale domestically.
That's the crux of it. They are improving their domestic capabilities, but they remain several years behind the leading edge currently dominated by Taiwan and South Korea, using equipment largely sourced from the US, Europe, and Japan. This dependence on foreign inputs for the absolute highest-end chips is a critical bottleneck that underpins so much modern tech, including the advanced computing power needed for cutting-edge AI research and military applications.
And the United States has clearly identified this dependence as a strategic choke point, haven't they? And they've decided to press on it hard.
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. government has taken direct, aggressive, and unprecedented actions specifically designed to exploit this vulnerability and curb China's access to advanced semiconductor technology.
What kind of actions?
They've imposed increasingly severe export controls. These restrictions aim to cut off China's access not just to the most advanced chips themselves, but also, crucially, to the sophisticated software tools used to design them and the highly specialized manufacturing equipment needed to produce them.
So blocking sales of both the chips and the means to make them.
Precisely. We saw reports, for example, in 2024 that the U.S. effectively directed or pressured major manufacturers like TSMC in Taiwan to stop supplying advanced chips specifically defined as those using 7-nanometer process technology or better to their clients in mainland China. This hit companies involved in AI, supercomputing, and other strategic sectors very hard.
And this strategy has a name, doesn't it?
It's been explicitly termed a chip war by many observers and even some officials.
A chip war. And the goal is pretty blatant.
The stated goal from the U.S. perspective is quite clear: to deliberately slow down China's technological progression, particularly in strategically critical areas that rely on high-performance computing, like advanced AI development, hypersonic missile research, next-generation military systems. The idea is to choke off their supply of these essential enabling components and hinder their ability to manufacture them domestically at the leading edge, thereby maintaining a technological advantage for the U.S. and its allies.
So, faced with this major vulnerability and this intense U.S. pressure, how is China responding? They can't just accept being cut off, presumably.
No, absolutely not. China's response has been predictable but forceful. A massive, top-down, centrally directed national effort to achieve self-sufficiency in semiconductors. It's become perhaps their top technological priority.
Pouring money into it.
Enormous amounts of state funding, subsidies, and resources are being channeled into bolstering their own domestic semiconductor industry, supporting national champions like SMAC, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, and many other companies involved in chip design, manufacturing, packaging, and equipment making.
The goal is clear. Break the foreign dependence.
Exactly. Achieve self-reliance, particularly in the foundational and leading-edge chip technologies. Now, this is a monumental task. Catching up to the global leaders at the absolute cutting edge who have decades of experience in complex global supply chains will likely take many years and faces immense technical hurdles, especially without access to the best foreign equipment.
But the determination is there.
The political will and the resources being thrown at the problem are immense. The long-term aim is clearly to eliminate this critical point of foreign leverage and vulnerability.
It really does sound like a high-stakes technological arms race, focused on these tiny pieces of silicon.
It absolutely is. Control over advanced semiconductors is seen as control over the future technological landscape.
And just to loop back quickly, on the flip side of that coin, speaking of areas where China is achieving industrial and technological dominance, we have to revisit that green energy sector.
Yes, that's an area where China's position is incredibly strong, almost dominant globally.
We're talking solar panels, batteries, EVs.
That's right. China has strategically invested and scaled up production to become the world's undisputed leading manufacturer in all three of those key areas for the global transition to a green economy.
What kind of market share are we talking about?
The figures are quite staggering. For solar panels, China controls a huge percentage of global production capacity across the entire supply chain, from polysilicon to finished modules. For rechargeable lithium-ion batteries, essential for EVs and energy storage, China also holds a dominant share of global manufacturing capacity. And as we discussed with BYD, they are now the world's largest producer of electric vehicles themselves.
Over 50% of global capacity in these key areas we saw mentioned.
Easily over 50% globally for production capacity in solar panels, batteries, and EVs combined. This isn't just about manufacturing prowess, it consolidates their industrial influence in sectors that are absolutely central to the world's future energy landscape and transportation systems. It gives them significant economic leverage, shapes global supply chains for these critical technologies, and positions them as the indispensable player in the global climate transition, even as they remain the world's largest carbon emitter overall.
A complex picture. Okay, so looking across all these dimensions we've discussed, the immense economic power and reach, the rapidly modernizing military projecting regional strength, and this dynamic emergence as a technological leader and competitor, it becomes undeniably clear that China's influence and capabilities are expanding dramatically on the global stage.
No doubt about it. The scale and scope are transformative.
And this broad, multifaceted ascent naturally translates into expanding geopolitical reach, doesn't it? Influence beyond its borders.
Absolutely. China's diplomatic footprint and economic influence are now strongly felt in virtually every corner of the world, far beyond East Asia.
We talked about the Belt and Road Initiative earlier, primarily from an economic perspective, building infrastructure.
Mm.
But its significance as a tool for expanding geopolitical influence seems equally, if not more, profound.
It really serves both purposes simultaneously, and the geopolitical aspect is arguably paramount in the eyes of many international observers, especially in the West.
It's far more than just laying down roads and railway tracks for trade. It feels like it's about weaving this intricate web of physical connections, dependencies, and relationships that ultimately enhance China's access and influence globally.
That's a very good way to capture it. While China consistently frames the BRI in terms of shared development, connectivity, and mutual prosperity for all participating countries, the sheer scale and strategic nature of many BRI projects, ports, pipelines, fiber optic cables, are widely interpreted by the United States and others as a direct reflection of China's immense global ambitions.
Ambitions for what, specifically in geopolitical terms?
Ambitions to secure reliable access to natural resources and energy, ambitions to open new markets for Chinese goods and construction services, ambitions to gain strategic access to key maritime choke points or locations through port deals, and ultimately ambitions to create a more Sino-centric global order where China plays a more central role and its influence rivals or surpasses that of the U.S.
We mentioned Brookings noting the BRI provoked significant concern in Washington, seen through that lens of strategic competition.
Exactly. It's viewed less as pure economic development assistance and more as a calculated strategy for China to create economic dependencies, potentially trapping countries in debt, gain strategic footholds, raising concerns about the potential for future military access to BRI ports, for example, and fundamentally reshape global trade patterns and political alignments in ways that favor China's long-term strategic interests. It's seen as building the infrastructure for a new sphere of influence.
Let's zoom in on some specific regions where this expanding influence is particularly visible. Africa seems like a key example. China's engagement there goes back decades, but it seems to have really ramped up.
It has indeed. China has been building political relationships and providing development assistance in Africa for a long time, often positioning itself as a partner without the colonial baggage of some Western powers. But in the last 15-20 years, the economic engagement, particularly investment, has exploded.
Especially recently, post-pandemic.
Yes, we saw reports indicating a significant spike in new Chinese investment commitments in Africa recently, particularly targeting infrastructure development and, very heavily, the mining sector. One report cited a dramatic 114% year-on-year growth in new Chinese investment projects announced last year alone.
114% growth.
Yeah.
What are they investing in specifically? Mining, you mentioned.
A lot of the focus is on securing access to the critical minerals that Africa has in abundance and that China's own industrial production desperately needs. Things like copper, cobalt, lithium essential for batteries, and the green tech manufacturing we discussed, as well as traditional energy resources like oil and gas. They are financing and building the mines, the roads, the railways, and the ports needed to extract these resources and ship them back to China.
This intensive focus on resource extraction, combined with funding these huge infrastructure projects that are often built by Chinese companies using predominantly Chinese labor. This has drawn some criticism, hasn't it?
Yes, it certainly has. Some analysts and critics argue that this pattern looks worryingly familiar. They suggest it follows a model reminiscent of historical colonialism, or at least neo-colonialism, where the primary focus is on extracting raw materials and establishing economic dependencies, rather than fostering genuinely broad-based, sustainable local development, local employment, or value-added industries within Africa itself.
The resource curse idea, fueled by external powers.
That's part of the critique. Concerns are also raised about the environmental standards of some projects, labor practices, and the often opaque terms of the loans provided, which can lead to unsustainable debt burdens for African nations.
How does Beijing respond to these criticisms?
Beijing strongly and consistently defends its approach in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world. They vehemently push back against the colonialism or neocolonialism labels.
That's their counterargument.
They maintain that their engagement is based on principles of mutual respect, equality, and non-interference in internal affairs, contrasting this with what they portray as the often conditional or politically motivated aid from Western countries. They argue that they are responding to the stated needs and priorities of African governments themselves, delivering badly needed infrastructure that Western partners were often unwilling or unable to finance. And they claim their projects genuinely support local industrialization and improve livelihoods, offering a different, partnership-based model for development.
So two very different narratives about the same engagement. Let's shift focus now to Latin America. We're seeing a similar pattern of expanding Chinese influence there too, even closer to the traditional U.S. sphere of influence.
Absolutely. China's rise as a major player in Latin America over the past 2 decades has been remarkable and strategically significant.
How so? What's the main impact?
Economically, China has rapidly become the primary trading partner for many countries across South America, displacing the United States from that top spot in several key nations like Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay. Trade volumes have soared.
So buying raw materials and selling manufactured goods.
Largely that pattern, yes. China is a huge buyer of Latin American commodities, soybeans, copper, iron ore, oil, and it exports manufactured goods back. But beyond trade, China has also become a major source of foreign direct investment and, critically, large-scale loans for infrastructure development across the continent.
Similar to Africa then, building ports, dams, railways.
Very similar playbook. Financing and constructing megaports on both the Pacific and Atlantic coasts, huge hydroelectric dams, new railway lines designed to link interior resource areas to coastal ports. Many of these projects explicitly fall under the umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative, which China officially extended to Latin America in recent years.
And we saw analysis confirming this.
Yes, reports from institutions like Brookings and the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, consistently highlight this trend. They point out that, quote, China is the #1 commercial partner of South America and a principal source of FDI and loans for energy and infrastructure, including the BRI. It's a fundamental shift in the region's economic orientation.
And is China's engagement in Latin America purely economic, or are there other dimensions too?
It's expanding beyond just economics. For instance, China is collaborating actively with several Latin American countries on space technology, launching joint satellites, building ground stations. This cooperation builds technological ties.
And military ties.
There's also evidence of strengthening military-to-military relationships with certain nations in the region, like Venezuela, involving arms sales, training exchanges, and naval visits. While still limited compared to U.S. military engagement, these growing security ties are definitely noted in Washington.
So this expanding presence, economic dominance, technological cooperation, growing military links right in America's backyard, so to speak, that must be causing concern in Washington.
It is, understandably, a source of significant alarm and intense focus for U.S. policymakers. They see China making major inroads in a region traditionally considered firmly within the U.S. strategic orbit, challenging U.S. influence and potentially altering the geopolitical landscape of the Western Hemisphere.
Okay, so we see China expanding influence region by region. What about its role in the big, established global institutions? And is it building alternatives there too?
Yes, China has become increasingly assertive and influential both within the existing multilateral system and, simultaneously, in promoting and building alternative frameworks. It's a dual-track approach.
Let's start with the existing system, the United Nations, for example.
As one of the 5 permanent members, P5, of the UN Security Council, China holds a crucial veto power. This gives it a potent tool to shape outcomes, block resolutions it opposes, and protect its interests on critical global security issues debated in the Council. Its vote is essential.
And beyond the veto, are they contributing more actively?
They have significantly increased their financial contributions. China is now the second largest financial contributor to both the overall UN regular budget and, perhaps more notably, to UN peacekeeping missions around the world.
Contributing more money to Blue Helmets.
Yes. This demonstrates a commitment to contributing to global institutions and shouldering more responsibility, though their participation in peacekeeping is always framed very strictly within the principle of state sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs, reflecting their core foreign policy tenets.
Have they taken on more leadership roles?
Increasingly so. For example, in 2025, China held the rotating presidency of the Security Council for its designated month, giving it a platform to set the agenda and guide discussions. And you routinely see high-level Chinese delegations participating actively in numerous global summits, major climate change conferences, the COP-Ps, global health forums, economic gatherings projecting an image of responsible international leadership on key global challenges like climate action and sustainable development.
So working within the system, increasing their clout, but you said they're also building alternatives.
Yes, and this is a crucial part of their strategy. While engaging with and seeking to reform existing institutions like the UN, IMF, and World Bank to better reflect its weight, China is also actively promoting and investing in alternative structures where it plays a more central or even dominant role.
We already mentioned the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB. What else?
The AIIB is a key example in the financial sphere. Another is the New Development Bank, NDB, often called the BRICS Bank, established by the BRICS group of nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which has now expanded to include several other countries. China was a driving force behind the NDB's creation as an alternative source of development finance.
So, creating options outside the traditional Bretton Woods institutions.
Exactly. And beyond specific institutions, China is actively cultivating broader alliances and closer political and economic ties, particularly with countries in the global south. It positions itself as a leader and advocate for the interests of developing nations, often contrasting its partnership model with that of the West.
This dual approach, engaging within the existing system while simultaneously building parallel structures and alternative alliances, how is that generally interpreted? What's the perceived goal?
Well, it's often framed by analysts, particularly in the West, as a deliberate long-term effort by China to fundamentally change the global rules.
Change them how? In what direction?
The perceived goal in this view is to gradually reshape the international system away from what Beijing often portrays as a U.S.-dominated or Western-centric order towards a more multipolar world, a world where China has a greater say, where its interests and values are better reflected, and where it plays a leading role in setting norms, rules, and global agendas across a whole range of critical issues, from international trade and investment rules, to internet governance and technology standards, to definitions of human rights and development models. It's about shifting the center of global power and influence eastward.
Okay. We've now traced this incredible trajectory, China's multifaceted ascent, its transformation into an absolute economic powerhouse, its rapid and formidable military modernization, its emergence as a global technological leader and intense competitor, and its steadily expanding geopolitical reach and influence across the globe.
It's a huge picture.
It is. And looking at that picture, it becomes almost unavoidably clear, doesn't it, that this immense transformation, this surge in comprehensive national power, has brought China into significant direct tension and competition with the established global power, the United States.
Yes. It seems almost structurally inevitable, based on historical patterns of rising powers challenging established ones. The friction was bound to increase dramatically.
And it's probably fair to say now that this dynamic, this relationship between the rising power, China, and the established power, the U.S., is the defining strategic rivalry of the 21st century. Would you agree?
I think that's widely accepted now. It's not the only important dynamic in the world, of course, but it is arguably the central organizing principle of current international relations. It overshadows and influences almost everything else.
And this rivalry isn't just confined to one specific area, like trade or military might. It's incredibly broad.
Completely. It touches on, as we've discussed, almost every facet of international relations and global governance, economics, finance, technology, security, diplomacy, ideology, even global norms and values.
Okay, so let's dive into the core elements of this rivalry itself. Where are the most significant flashpoints? And perhaps the single most sensitive, most dangerous potential flashpoint within this whole relationship revolves around the issue of Taiwan, doesn't it?
Without a doubt, Taiwan is consistently identified by defense analysts and diplomats as the most likely trigger for a direct military conflict between the United States and China. The stakes there are incredibly high.
What makes it so uniquely dangerous? What's the fundamental disagreement?
The disagreement over Taiwan's status is stark, deeply rooted in history and ideology, and fundamentally irreconcilable under current policies. China's Communist Party views Taiwan, officially the Republic of China, as an inalienable part of its territory, a renegade province that must eventually be unified with the mainland.
Reunification is the term they use.
Yes. And they explicitly reserve the right to use force to achieve this goal if peaceful means fail, or if Taiwan moves towards formal independence. Beijing frames this strictly as an internal Chinese affair, rejecting any foreign interference.
And the U.S. position?
The U.S. position is complex and deliberately ambiguous. Washington switched formal diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing in 1979, acknowledging Beijing's One China principle, which states there is only one China and Taiwan is part of it. However, the U.S. only acknowledges Beijing's claim over Taiwan. It doesn't explicitly endorse it. Crucially, the U.S. maintains a robust, unofficial relationship with democratic Taiwan through the American Institute in Taiwan.
And provides arms.
Yes, under the Taiwan Relations Act, passed by Congress in 1979, the U.S. is legally obligated to provide Taiwan with the arms necessary for its self-defense. The U.S. is by far Taiwan's primary source of advanced military equipment and support.
And there's the policy of strategic ambiguity.
Right. For decades, the U.S. has maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity regarding whether it would actually intervene militarily if China were to attack Taiwan. The idea is that this ambiguity deters China from attacking because the U.S. might intervene, and simultaneously deters Taiwan from provoking Beijing by declaring formal independence, because U.S. help isn't absolutely guaranteed. Whether this ambiguity remains credible or effective is a subject of intense debate now.
And the U.S. continues to sell significant amounts of weaponry to Taiwan, fueling Beijing's anger.
Yes, arms sales are a constant source of friction. We saw figures highlighting this ongoing commitment. For instance, during the first Trump administration, something like USD 18.3 billion worth of arms sales to Taiwan were approved.
18.3 billion, that sounds like a lot.
It was noted as being more than double the amount approved during the entire preceding 8 years under President Obama. And expectations were that these sales would continue or perhaps even accelerate under the Biden administration, focusing increasingly on asymmetric capabilities, things like large numbers of anti-ship missiles, coastal defense systems, sea mines, drones, air defense systems, weapons designed specifically to make a potential Chinese invasion extremely difficult and costly.
Trying to turn Taiwan into a porcupine.
That's the concept, yes. Make the cost of swallowing it too high.
And how does Beijing react every time a new U.S. arms sale is announced?
Predictably, with intense anger and strong condemnation. They view these sales as direct interference in China's internal affairs, a violation of the spirit of the agreements underpinning U.S.-China relations, and a dangerous encouragement of what they see as Taiwan independence forces.
Do they issue warnings?
Always. We saw a specific example cited from December 2024, where the Chinese government lodged a formal diplomatic protest against a U.S. arms package, warning unequivocally that the United States was playing with fire by continuing to arm Taiwan. They consistently reiterate that they will defend their claims to sovereignty and achieve reunification, reserving the use of force as a necessary option, especially if red lines related to independence are crossed or if external forces try to prevent reunification indefinitely.
So the consequence of this fundamental disagreement, the U.S. arms sales, China's military buildup opposite Taiwan, it makes the Strait of Taiwan what? A constant potential flashpoint.
Absolutely. It's arguably the most dangerous potential military flashpoint on the planet. The Taiwan Strait is narrow, heavily militarized on both sides, and marked by frequent, almost daily, military maneuvers.
What kind of maneuvers?
Chinese military aircraft, including fighters, bombers, and drones, routinely fly into Taiwan's self-declared Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, testing Taiwan's responses and wearing down its air force. Chinese warships frequently patrol near Taiwan's waters, sometimes crossing the unofficial median line in the strait. The U.S. Navy, often joined by allied navies, conducts regular freedom of navigation transits through the Taiwan Strait, asserting international navigation rights, but seen by Beijing as provocations.
This sounds like a recipe for accidents or miscalculations.
It dramatically increases the risk. With so many military assets operating in close proximity in a highly charged political environment, the potential for an accidental collision, a misunderstanding, or a minor incident rapidly escalating into a major crisis or even conflict is dangerously high.
Okay, so Taiwan is clearly the most acute military flashpoint. But moving beyond the potential for direct conflict, the rivalry is also deeply entrenched in the realms of trade and economics, right? We touched on this earlier.
Yes, the economic competition is fierce and ongoing. There's been this persistent, sometimes escalating trade conflict between the two largest economies in the world, really dating back significantly to 2018.
That's when the Trump administration initiated major actions.
Correct. Citing concerns about the large bilateral trade deficit, alleged intellectual property theft, and other unfair trade practices, the U.S. imposed significant tariffs, eventually covering hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports.
And China's response?
China quickly retaliated with its own tariffs on a wide range of U.S. goods, particularly agricultural products, hitting politically sensitive sectors in the U.S. This kicked off what was widely dubbed the U.S.-China trade war.
Has that trade war ended? Or just paused?
That's a good question. While there have been periods of de-escalation, intense negotiations, and even a Phase 1 trade deal signed in early 2020, just before the pandemic hit hard, the underlying tensions and fundamental disagreements over trade practices have largely persisted.
So the tariffs are mostly still in place.
Many of the tariffs imposed by both sides remain in place today, although they are subject to ongoing reviews, potential adjustments, and exemptions processes. There hasn't been a comprehensive resolution or return to the pre-2018 status quo. We saw mentions of truces and partial agreements, like some early overtures in the Biden administration, but the core frictions remain.
And what are those core sticking points beyond just the tariff levels themselves?
Well, the fundamental disputes are still there. The large and persistent bilateral trade imbalance that significant surplus China runs with the U.S. and the corresponding U.S. deficit remains a major political issue in the U.S., even if economists debate its true significance.
And the accusations of unfair practices.
Those continue unabated from the U.S. side. Concerns about China's extensive use of state subsidies to support its domestic industries, giving them an edge. Concerns about requirements for foreign companies operating in China to transfer technology to Chinese partners. Allegations of ongoing widespread intellectual property theft through hacking and other means. And complaints about market access barriers that make it difficult for foreign firms to compete fairly within China in many sectors.
How does the economic analysis see this? Like the IMF?
It's interesting. We saw a mention that institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, have provided analysis suggesting that the current global trade imbalances, including the U.S.-China one, are often largely driven by internal macroeconomic factors within each country.
Meaning?
Meaning things like the difference between national savings and investment rates. For example, the U.S. tends to have low domestic savings and high consumption, leading to trade deficits, while China historically has had very high savings and investment rates, contributing to surpluses. So the IMF perspective often emphasizes these deeper structural factors.
But that nuanced economic view doesn't really cut it politically, does it?
Not really. Regardless of the underlying macroeconomic causes, these large imbalances and the persistent accusations of unfair play are potent political fuel. They heavily feed the narrative of economic rivalry and are clearly viewed through a strategic lens in both Washington and Beijing. Trade isn't just seen as mutually beneficial commerce anymore, it's increasingly framed as a zero-sum arena of state competition and national security.
Okay, another critical arena of conflict, often happening in the shadows but with huge implications, is in cyber capabilities and security.
Yes, the cyber domain is a constant battleground.
The United States has been very vocal, openly and repeatedly accusing China, specifically state-sponsored actors, of conducting extensive and highly sophisticated cyber espionage campaigns. Who are they targeting?
According to U.S. government reports and indictments, the targets are incredibly broad. They include U.S. government agencies, like the Office of Personnel Management hack years ago, defense contractors, critical infrastructure operators, energy grid, transportation, private companies across numerous sectors, especially tech, biotech, aerospace, research universities, think tanks, even politicians and journalists.
And the goal is primarily espionage, stealing secrets.
Primarily espionage, yes. Stealing classified government information, military secrets, advanced technology designs, sensitive intellectual property, corporate trade secrets, negotiating strategies, even personal data on millions of citizens. The perceived scale of the state-sponsored hacking has been described as the largest transfer of wealth in history by some U.S. officials.
Was there a specific recent example highlighted?
Yes, there was a notable example mentioned from March 2024. Authorities in both the United States and the United Kingdom took the somewhat unusual step of jointly indicting a specific hacking group they identified by the code name APT31.
APT for Advanced Persistent Threat.
Exactly, a term used for sophisticated state-backed hacking groups. And significantly, these joint indictments explicitly linked APT31 directly to China's Ministry of State Security, or MSS, which is Beijing's main civilian intelligence agency.
So, directly attributing the hacking campaign to the Chinese government, what did they accuse APT31 of doing?
The indictments provided quite a bit of detail. They alleged that this single group, APT31, had engaged in a sprawling, multi-year hacking campaign targeting a vast array of victims across multiple countries.
Who were the victims?
The list included high-ranking government officials and their advisors, legislators, including critics of Beijing, academics specializing in China, journalists, democracy activists, and a long list of Western companies involved in strategically important sectors like defense, aerospace, information technology, and telecommunications.
And what was the alleged purpose? What were they stealing?
It was portrayed as a systematic campaign of both traditional espionage and intellectual property theft, allegedly stealing sensitive political and economic intelligence from government and academic targets, personal information on dissidents, and crucially, valuable intellectual property and trade secrets from technology firms and defense contractors. It was presented as a comprehensive, state-directed effort to gain strategic advantage through cyber means.
How does China typically respond to these kinds of detailed accusations and indictments?
As you might expect, China consistently and vehemently denies these accusations. They typically dismiss them as baseless, politically motivated slander orchestrated by the U.S. and its allies.
Do they make counter accusations?
Yes. Beijing frequently turns the tables, accusing the United States itself of being the world's biggest cyber attacker, conducting its own extensive global cyber espionage operations, citing revelations like those from Edward Snowden as proof. They portray themselves as victims, not perpetrators, of cyber attacks.
So deep mutual distrust and finger pointing in the cyber realm.
Absolutely. This deep distrust permeates everything related to digital security. It fuels the ongoing efforts to secure critical infrastructure like 5G networks from potential foreign interference. It drives concerns about the security of government email systems, cloud computing services, and the overall resilience of national digital infrastructure against state-sponsored attacks originating from the other side. The digital domain is clearly a persistent, active arena of conflict and suspicion between the U.S. and China.
This really underscores how the technological realm isn't just a separate category of economic competition. It's become a central front, maybe the central front, in the overall strategic rivalry. Some people are now explicitly calling it a technological war.
That term seems increasingly apt, doesn't it? It certainly has many characteristics of a strategic conflict fought through technological means.
We see the U.S. actively using offensive tools, like those export controls on advanced semiconductors we discussed. What else characterizes this technological war?
Well, it's the combination of offensive and defensive measures. Offensively, the U.S. is trying to limit China's access to critical technologies, not just chips, but potentially also advanced software, manufacturing equipment, and other key components needed for developing leading-edge capabilities in AI, quantum computing, biotech, etc.
And defensively.
Defensively, the U.S. is working to protect its own technological advantages and secure its networks and supply chains. This involves screening Chinese investments in sensitive U.S. tech sectors, funding domestic R&D and manufacturing, like through the CHIPS Act, and, as we've seen, continually pressuring allies to adopt similar restrictions and exclude Chinese companies, particularly Huawei, from their sensitive technology infrastructure, especially 5G networks.
So trying to build a coalition to contain China's tech rise.
That appears to be a key part of the strategy, creating a sort of technological bloc among allies.
And China's counter strategy, as we noted, is this determined long-term national push for technological self-sufficiency, or self-reliance, as they often call it.
Exactly. To reduce or completely eliminate these critical dependencies on foreign technology, particularly from the U.S. and its close allies, in strategic sectors. They see this as essential for their national security and continued development in the face of U.S. pressure.
So the intense competition we're observing across the board in artificial intelligence, in next-generation telecommunications like 6G, in green energy manufacturing dominance, even in space exploration, where both countries have ambitious programs.
It's not merely about which country has the coolest gadgets or the most profitable companies, is it?
No, not at its core. While commercial success and innovation are obviously important drivers, the competition in these strategic technology areas is fundamentally about building national power, gaining strategic advantage, reducing vulnerabilities, and ultimately shaping the future global technological landscape according to their own interests and standards. It's deeply geopolitical.
And that Brookings analysis you mentioned earlier seemed to capture this complexity well. Yes, it summarized the situation by noting that the concerns surrounding companies like Huawei and TikTok are inherently multidimensional. They reflect the complex interplay between technology, economics, national security, data privacy, and geopolitics. Responding to China's comprehensive technological and economic rise isn't simple. It involves navigating all these intertwined dimensions simultaneously. It shows it's not just one issue, but a reflection of the entire complex strategic dynamic at play.
Okay, let's try and bring all these different threads together now. We've looked at the massive economic power and global reach, the rapidly modernizing military challenging regional balances, the fierce technological race with huge security implications, and the expanding diplomatic and geopolitical influence across the world.
It's a lot to synthesize.
It is. But when you put it all together, it seems unmistakably clear that the United States and China are now deeply engaged in a broad, comprehensive, long-term competition. A competition for global influence, perhaps even for global leadership, or some might argue hegemony, in the 21st century.
That really does seem to be the core, overarching dynamic shaping international affairs today. It's the central rivalry.
And how are the two sides approaching this competition? What are their broad strategies?
While China, on the one hand, is actively promoting its own unique development model, often emphasizing state leadership, rapid infrastructure development, and poverty reduction, presenting it, implicitly or explicitly, as a potential alternative path for other developing nations, particularly those wary of Western conditions or interference.
And projecting influence outwards.
And systematically expanding its influence, as we've discussed, particularly in the global south, through massive initiatives like the Belt and Road, robust economic engagement, vaccine diplomacy during the pandemic, and cultivating political partnerships.
And the United States, what's its counter strategy?
The U.S., meanwhile, is responding primarily by trying to strengthen its traditional alliances, revitalizing NATO in Europe to face challenges including China, and reinforcing its treaty alliances in Asia
Right.
with Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand,
And building new partnerships.
and forming new strategic partnerships and economic frameworks that often seem designed, at least in part, to counter China's growing weight and offer alternatives. Examples include the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the Quad, involving the US, Japan, India, and Australia, which focuses on Indo-Pacific security, or initiatives like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, intended partly to offer regional countries an economic engagement model centered on the US as an alternative to deeper integration with China, especially after the US pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP.
So strengthening old alliances, building new ones, often seen as ways to balance or contain China's expansion.
That's certainly how Beijing interprets many of these moves as containment efforts aimed at thwarting China's rightful rise.
And within this larger strategic competition, those specific flashpoints we've discussed keep cropping up as constant sources of friction.
Yes. The really sensitive issues, the status of Taiwan, the struggle for leadership and access in advanced technology sectors, the military balance and security dynamics playing out daily across the Indo-Pacific, especially in the South China Sea. These are the areas where the rivalry is most acute and the risk of escalation is highest. They are persistent tests of resolve.
And beneath those high-profile flashpoints, there's this constant, quieter competition for partners and influence happening globally.
Absolutely. Both countries are actively vying for allegiance and influence around the world, whether it's through offering economic incentives and investments, diplomatic engagement and support in international forums, security cooperation and arms sales, or even projecting soft power and competing narratives. This competition plays out intensely in key regions like Africa, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and Latin America. Everyone is being asked, implicitly or explicitly, to choose sides or navigate carefully between the two giants.
And finally, they're also competing to set the agenda on major global issues.
Yes, both Washington and Beijing want to be seen as leaders, shaping the global conversation and driving solutions, or shaping the rules, on pressing transnational challenges that affect everyone. Things like combating climate change, responding effectively to global health crises like pandemics, setting the rules and norms for international digital trade, governing cyberspace, managing artificial intelligence ethically. Leadership on these global governance issues is another key dimension of their competition for legitimacy and influence.
So putting it all together, it really reinforces that perception of a deep, pervasive, and likely long-lasting, sustained strategic rivalry that is set to define international relations for the foreseeable future.
I think that's a very accurate assessment of the current global landscape.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, reflecting on everything we've unpacked, it becomes incredibly clear, doesn't it, how these complex and multifaceted dynamics between China and the United States, this overarching rivalry, truly touch upon so many aspects of the world you, the listener, experience every single day.
It really does connect to everything, often in ways we don't immediately realize. Think about it. From the prices you pay for everyday goods, which are influenced by global supply chains, trade tensions, and tariffs,
Right, the cost of things on the shelf.
to the technology platforms you use every day, like your smartphone or social media apps, which are increasingly caught up in these security debates and potential restrictions,
The availability of the latest innovations.
all the way to the broader, more fundamental questions of international stability, the balance of power between nations, and the risk of conflict, which ultimately affect global security and prosperity for everyone. This relationship is truly a fundamental force shaping our current reality and our future.
And throughout this deep dive, our primary aim, really, has been to try and present the information and the different perspectives drawn from the material we explored, laying out the facts as reported, the actions being taken by both sides, the claims and counterclaims being made.
Without us taking a position or endorsing any particular viewpoint or political stance.
Exactly. Because fundamentally, we believe that understanding what is actually happening, comprehending the sheer scale of China's rise across the different dimensions,
Yeah.
and understanding the resultant friction and competition with the U.S., that understanding is the absolutely essential first step.
You need that foundation to even begin to grasp its potential impact on you, on your country, on the world we all share. It's about providing you with clarity on the key drivers, the main points of contention, and the areas of most intense competition in this incredibly crucial global relationship.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, instead of trying to offer some neat summary or making risky predictions about where this all leads, perhaps the most valuable thing we can do is leave you with a thought, a question, to continue pondering on your own.
Something to mull over.
Yeah. Given the sheer scope and the intensity of this U.S.-China rivalry that we've laid out, spanning everything from, the basic goods on our supermarket shelves
Yeah.
to the most advanced semiconductors and satellites in orbit to the very rules governing the global financial system and the internet.
It's incredibly broad.
It is. So given that breadth, what might a future world actually look like, where both of these immense global powers continue to gain influence, continue to project power, and continue to compete so fiercely across such a vast array of different domains?
And maybe, how might the ongoing contest, this sustained rivalry between these two giants, reshape the possibilities, or perhaps, sadly, the limitations for genuine international cooperation on the truly global challenges? The challenges like climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation, the things that affect every single person on this planet, regardless of nationality, and arguably require collective action.
It's a huge question with no easy answers.
Yeah.
Keep watching these dynamics unfold. Keep looking for how these tensions, these competitions, and perhaps occasionally areas of cooperation manifest themselves in the news you consume and the world developing around you. Because understanding this fundamental relationship between the U.S. and China is increasingly absolutely key to understanding the shape of things to come.